Hi, and welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us for a second week of Workforce Readiness. Today, we're going to talk about self advocacy and communication and how that's a major component of workforce readiness. The objective of this presentation is to get you to think about your own communication style and learn how and why to become a self advocate, especially a self advocate in the professional environment. So, being a self advocate requires you to learn how to speak up for yourself. It also requires you to have the ability to communicate your needs and wants with others. It also requires you to understand your rights and responsibilities, and also requires you to have input in your life decisions um, in your professional career. So, self advocacy and communication plays an important role in successful employment, and it's going to be super important as you develop a career. So, without much further ado, let's talk about this presentation and this topic. So, first, let's talk about what self advocacy is. Self advocacy is learning how to speak up for yourself. It's also having the ability to communicate your needs and wants with others. It's also understanding your rights and responsibilities. And it's also having input about your life decisions. These are all important parts of self advocacy. And if you really think about it, it's a really good thing to just kind of flush out and think about how you could be a self advocate for yourself in your career. When you're thinking about self advocacy, it might be important for you to consider times in the past where you've just generally been an advocate for someone else. Perhaps there was a situation in the past where you've had to be an advocate for a friend or an advocate for a family member. Think about how you acted when you were advocating for them. And think about how you were able to communicate with others about their needs and how they could maybe get those needs met. So, for example, maybe your friend and you went to a restaurant and maybe their order was not correct. And so you had to advocate for your friend to get the correct order. So you had to talk to the server, to the people that work at that restaurant to get that fixed. So think about how you communicated and think about how you communicated effectively to get that done. So, in another scenario, you could think of a situation where you advocated for a family, maybe at school. And so maybe they were interested in taking a class, and so you had to kind of get information, you had to talk to certain people to get this done. And that ultimately, I hope that got them the result that they needed. Okay, so think about how you advocated for them and how you could advocate for yourself. Sometimes it becomes challenging to advocate for yourself, and many people find it extremely challenging because they're just used to maybe sticking up for someone else or communicating for someone else, but they just kind of forget that there's someone that they're themselves are someone that they should advocate for themselves as well. So if you really think about it, one of the first exercises when you're applying for a position will require self-advocacy. And that's the interview that you're going to do when you first interview for a position. So when you interview for a position, you're generally sitting down with a representative from the job that you're applying for, and they're going to ask you a couple of questions, right? So those questions are just generally tailored to getting to know what type of person you are, what type of skills you have, and what type of education you have, and and they're just generally trying to see whether you would be a good fit for the position. So when you're in that interview, you have to be a self advocate. And so you have to talk about yourself at length. And sometimes that is extremely challenging for people. It's extremely challenging because we're not typically used to, in a way, talk about our accomplishments. And so some people may see that as maybe bragging too much, or maybe saying that you've done something or said something else or did something else. And so it becomes challenging. So if you find that becoming a self advocate during an interview is challenging for you, I would suggest that you maybe take some time, take account of all the accomplishments that you've done, write about how you're going to talk about them, and let that outline just kind of guide your conversation. But that interview is one of those first opportunities for you to become a self advocate. Okay, so uh, you have to become a self advocate for yourself in that sense. So let's talk about essential self advocacy skills, and they're mainly composed of the following. I think that's generally all of them. So there is a self awareness, self esteem, self determination, communication, rights and responsibilities, and also leadership. Okay. So self awareness essentially has to deal with you being aware of yourself, of your abilities, and how you could fix certain things. Okay. So, for example, if you're applying for a position and it's a customer service position, you may be self aware of your ability to talk to people and your ability to work people through issues, and that may build your self advocacy. So that builds your self awareness as I am an effective customer service person and I could fix these issues, and I'm confident of fixing these issues. There's also self esteem or your self worth. So, with this, um, you could build self advocacy by just having that self esteem, that self worth, indicating that you are able to be successful in this career and be effective in this career. Okay. There's also the self determination or your ability to make your own decisions. And so when you're in the work environment, you may have to take advice from your managers, but having that sense of self determination will help make sure that you are still pretty effective without having to be micromanaged. Okay, so being able to make your own decisions, being able to obtain your own information to make informed decisions, that's what self determination is all about. Communication has to do with your way of communicating with other people. This includes your verbal communication, your written communication, your way of doing body language. Body language is a big part of communication, but essentially, uh, you could kind of take stock of what type of communication style you have and see how you could apply that to your self advocacy. Okay, in a work environment, you're going to want to have a certain body language, a certain style of talking, a certain style of writing. And so communication is just one of those things that you'll continuously work on throughout your journey as a person in your career. Okay. There's rights and responsibilities, like knowing what your rights are and knowing what your responsibilities are. Having a clear cut understanding of what that is will help you build self advocacy. So, for example, if you know that your rights entitle you to a certain benefit, you know that you could advocate for yourself to get that benefit because it's part of your rights. Okay. Then obviously your responsibilities, you could advocate for yourself because you know that you're responsible for certain things. And so you'll need to advocate to communicate to other people what you need to accomplish that responsibility. Okay. Then finally, we have leadership, which is one of the most important items, I believe. And leadership has to do with your ability to be a leader and to be proactive at work. And so you want to be able to accomplish your duties effectively as a leader. And all positions have a component of leadership built into them. No matter how entry level or how senior your position may be, you could demonstrate leadership at all levels. And so you want to be able to show leadership, to show that you could complete certain tasks and be proactive. And not only that, but be proactive, respecting the wishes of a manager, or maybe the wishes of a customer, things of that sort. Okay, so these are all essential self-advocacy skills that you could think about. And I want you to think about these as something that you develop throughout your career. It's not necessarily something that you've 100% mastered at the very beginning, but these are things that you continuously work on, and that you continuously base, um, uh, and that you continuously develop throughout your career. Okay. So, where can I practice self advocacy? So, a great place to start practicing self advocacy is when you're at school. Any meeting that is about you is where you could start speaking up about your wants and needs. So, when you're meeting with the school counselor, or when you're meeting with me, your teacher, you could talk to me about your needs and your wants, and that would help advocate for yourself. Uh, from this practice, you could start practicing this at work in your career. So, at the very beginning, when you're applying for a job, if you have like a job listing and you're not quite sure what that job listing requires, and you have a bunch of questions, you could practice self advocacy by contacting the human resources department at that job to ask them questions. And so when you're asking the questions about the job, you're actively being a self advocate. So you may want to ask them, does this job require some sort of responsibility, or what are the daily functions of the job, or does the job allow me to have a flexible schedule, or does the job have certain benefits, or does the job have a way for me to have a benefit where they cover tuition or something like that. So when you're first applying for a position, you become a self advocate because you could reach out to them, you could be proactive, and try to get the information you need to figure out whether you want to apply for the job. Okay. When you're interviewing for a position, as I mentioned before, you're becoming a self advocate by talking about yourself and giving them the information they need to make the decision on whether to hire you. And afterwards, when you're hired, you may be a self advocate by just letting them know what type of things you need to complete your tasks, or what type of things are required, who needs to work together to complete certain tasks. So, this practice that you have as a self advocate at school will help you, because any practice is helpful, and it'll help you develop those skills eventually. So, you could learn ways to, when you become a self advocate, you could learn ways to set goals for yourself, tell others what you want, and share with others what works and does not work for you. And there's other things that you could learn. It's important for you to learn how to do this self advocacy, but in a way that is professional in the professional field. And so you want to also be able to show that that you can identify what's necessary, and kind of work collaboratively with the people at work to make sure that they could provide what you need without much much issue. Okay, so you always want to be proactive at work, and also be flexible at work, so you can work within your confines of what the work will provide for you. Okay. So, what are my rights and responsibilities? So, rights are essentially socially correct or responsible behaviors, facts, truth, or laws based. And they're based on laws. And then your responsibilities are a duty or task that you are expected or required to do. Okay, so knowing what your rights are an important part of self-advocacy because this gives you kind of like a basis of what you could ask for. So if you're within your rights to ask for a certain thing, because maybe the law provides for it or something like that, so you could advocate. Let's say if the state just passed some sort of a law that required you to have like a helmet at work, and so you could tell your employer, I know that as an advocate, as an advocate for yourself, you could contact your employer and say, I know the state recently just passed a certain law, and I feel that I may need this protection just to be within the law. And so there is that aspect of being a self advocate. And so for responsibility, you could have a good understanding of your responsibilities and know how to ask for certain things that are required so that so that you could complete that responsibility. So for example, if you need to take care of a certain task, you may need item A, B, and C in order to do that. And so you have to advocate for yourself to get those items or speak up. So for example, you may have a conversation with your employer and let them know, hey, we need to complete this task, but I need item A, B, and C to complete the task. Can you provide that to us or something like that? Okay. So essentially, those are rights and responsibilities and how they fit into the self-advocacy subject. So the next item that I like to talk about is how we communicate with each other, and communication is key, of course. And so communication, it will be something that people develop throughout your careers, and it's always good to find better ways to communicate with coworkers the best that you can and in the most respectful way that you can. Okay, so let's talk about communication. And guess what? When you're first growing up, you learn communication at home. Okay, so right here we have a funny cartoon picture of the most common siblings in the back seat, where the siblings are getting on each other's nerves, probably in a long like drive to a vacation spot or something. But how we communicate with family and friends kind of forms the basis of how we communicate with others, right? So when we communicate with our friends and family, we talk nice, we may joke or tease, we may send text messages. In those text messages, we may use slang like OMG or abbreviations, or when we see each other, we may hug, or may if you're close to your friend or family, you may kiss, things of that sort. So these are all things that you do at home, and there's different types of cultures out there, and there's different ways that we interact with people. But this essentially is kind of like the first way that we learn how to interact with each other. And so it's no surprise that when people are first getting their first jobs, they may have challenges learning the differences between how to communicate at home and how to communicate at work. So two different things that are separate. At home, you're a little bit more informal. It can be more informal. At work, there's a certain type of decorum that's required. And so it's always good for you to keep that in mind. So communication at work, and this kind of, when you become a self-advocate, you kind of have to work within these confines. Okay, so you have to work within these general requirements. So at work, much different from home because home is more informal. But at work, you may just generally communicate with others through handshakes, and so not so much hugs. So you're going to be required to be friendly, At times, if you're having a bad morning, you might be grumpy, but you may want to make that effort to be friendly and to be upbeat with your coworkers. Okay, at least enough so that you could complete certain things. You're gonna want to have appropriate languages, so you may want to not use so much slang or just like abbreviations that you use with your family. But you want to use appropriate language, professional language that's respectful, and language that will help communicate and get the point across as quickly as possible without much delay. Okay, at work, you're going to have to pay attention to what people tell you. If you need a notepad, take a notepad so you can write it down and keep that in mind. Also, at work, there's like zero, there's a zero policy, there's zero tolerance policy on fighting and being aggressive with each other. So your coworkers generally inappropriate if they're going to be aggressive or if they're going to be intimidating towards you. You have to keep in mind that you see these people 40 hours a week, so that's a lot of time. And so you always have to just be respectful and not be aggressive or with your coworkers. And also, when you communicate with coworkers, there could be like a brief boundary that is placed where you may not want to share personal stuff as much as you would at home. Okay, so and of course, like it's all on a scale. Different work environments are different, and they may have different ways of communicating with each other. But just generally, there's like this distinction between how you communicate with people at work and at home. So keep that in mind. At 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 work, there's definitely a certain type of decorum that needs to be met, and there's certain way of interacting with people that would be really important. Okay, so with this, we talk about communication style through email, and we don't have to go through all of these items point by point, but essentially, when you're writing emails in a professional sense, you have to be a little bit more formal, and you have to keep in mind important things like getting right to the point, noting when attachments are added, going over your email to make sure that there's no spelling or punctuation errors, always staying with a professional and readable font, and including a call to action if item is required. So, for example, letting the person know that you need certain things by the end of the week or by a certain time. That's important. Keeping a signature line. A signature line is added to the end of an email. It always includes your contact information and your title, and it's always important. So including that, making sure that your email has an appropriate tone. So with emails and written word, it's always hard to keep an eye on what type of tone a person may have. So you may also, when you're writing an email, you may want to think of how the person that's receiving the email will read the email. And so if you have like a irritated tone or like a sarcastic tone, just generally stay away from something like that. And if they do take your tone uh, wrong, if they misunderstand your tone, you could just kind of say, "I'm sorry, but I didn't mean it that way," or something like that. But just usually, it just keep the email language neutral so that you could just kind of it doesn't become an issue. And then also avoid shorthand, text language, and emoticons. And emoticons, you could use that at times when things are a little bit less informal, but generally, like when you're in a work environment, they're not really very formal, so you may want to just kind of stay away from such items. But every now and then I send an email to my friend and to my work friend, and I may put an emoji every now and then, just like in situations where it's not as formal, and so just keep that in mind. And also, You also want to be respectful of the recipient's time, so you want to just keep things short and sweet, and so keep that in mind. Also, whenever you're asking questions, you all want to be respectful of the other person's time. So you may want to ask, like, can you take a question now, or can we set up a time to discuss this at later date? And so you want to be respectful in both emails and interactions. You want to be respectful of the other person's time. Okay, so uh, for uh, for someone that may not have too much experience, if you're in that position, you may ask, how do I learn how to communicate at work when I have never had a job? Okay, so if this becomes very challenging, I remember when I first had my first job, um, it was a bit of challenge, and I really had to kind of eventually learn how to communicate well at work and how to communicate through email, how to be effective, things of that sort through communication. So, for someone, if you find yourself in that situation, you may want to maybe like have a friend help you and ask your friend a couple of questions on how they communicate professionally at work. Sometimes when I don't know how to ask or how to approach a certain subject, I may ask a friend, how would you approach this subject? And they might give you a certain suggestion. And so they may say, oh, you know what, I've had this situation in the past, and this is how I went through it, and this is what I did. So having that communication with coworkers or friends will help you find ways to approach certain issues. In situations where you have a friend that would like to help, maybe you could do role playing, and your friend could help you role play through a certain scenario, and you could think of ways that you could communicate. So this is especially helpful in situations where you have challenging situations where you want to find ways of how to communicate. So in challenging situations, I always recommend that you talk to your friends about how to communicate what needs to be done. Okay. And so this brings us to our final slide, which talks about social media. So social media is a very big component of how we interact with each other online. And social media has become a very big part of how to professionally engage with others in your career. So here we have the pictures from Photoshop, Instagram, Facebook, and also Twitter. But there's also another social media website called LinkedIn, and LinkedIn allows you to create a professional profile for yourself, and it allows you to interact with others in your career. Um, they've made it so that certain applications make it easier for you to apply for certain jobs if you're using LinkedIn, so you could easily apply for a job using that profile. Okay, so with social media, we're going to talk about this more in the future. But as far as being a self advocate, you could use social media to network with other people. And if you're applying for a position in a certain company or career, you may want to reach out for someone that has that position at the moment, and see what type of suggestions they have for you. And so being able to reach out to that person is a good way to be a self advocate, and it's a good way for you to obtain information to help you make informed decisions on how to apply, and how to and why to apply. Okay, so you could use social media. And you also have to keep in mind with social media, anything that's visible on social media could help an employer form a decision or an opinion about you. And so you could also be very cautious about what you share on social media, and just make sure that there's nothing out there that you'd regret sharing with an employer. Some employers have very strict social media guidances, and so depending on what type of job you're going for, they could have strict social media requirements, and you really want to be within those requirements just to make sure that you don't compromise your ability to get a job with that employer. Okay, so, but we'll talk more about social media, and how you could use that to communicate and be a self advocate later on in the class. Okay, but thank you. That's essentially it for this talk. So I'm hoping that the things that we went over will help you become a self advocate and build your communication skills so that you're an effective worker, so that you interview effectively, and so that you could get your goals, find your goals, and achieve your goals a little bit easier. Okay, well, thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.